I gave myself permission to go both more narrowly and more deeply, and I welcome the chance for questions and comments after the service. Unitarian Universalism traces its American origins to New England, and especially to the Puritans, and so I will focus this talk on them, using their early history to illuminate three themes that are still with us. First, religious pluralism was a fact of life almost from the beginning, even though not everybody, and perhaps not most, thought this was a good idea. Second, the politicization of religion began early. It is not an invention of the Trump administration. Third, freedom of conscience, actually a tenet of Roman Catholicism, can play out in multiple ways, some of them progressive and others not. Our opening words came from the leader of the Puritan migration of 1630, John Winthrop, who spoke to those aboard the Arbella, the flagship leading the 700 or so migrants who came with him. Winthrop was part of the gentry. His grandfather had been given church lands seized by Henry VIII, but these lands were now bringing in less revenue. Winthrop himself was trained as a lawyer. He was also deeply concerned with the direction that the Church of England was taking and the crackdown on religious dissenters going on throughout the 1620s. These included religious tests for various offices, which those who were being called Puritans could not pass. Winthrop, who had been appointed to the Court of Wards and Liveries, lost that position and its revenues. He decided that he would be among those to emigrate and would be the acknowledged leader of the colony. He was elected governor or lieutenant governor 18 times, meaning that for the most part, he was trusted and influential. He was not a minister, and Massachusetts Bay was not a theocracy. Ministers could not hold office and did not sit on any governmental council. Our opening words of a city upon a hill are a paraphrase of Matthew 5:14-15, and are most familiar to us because Ronald Reagan used these words and this image in his election eve speech, November 3rd, 1980. Reagan was reminding us of American exceptionalism and our destiny to be the world exemplar and world leader. Winthrop's band of 700 men, women, and children had a far more fearsome task, given the worldview that its leadership held. Winthrop and others were millenarian. They believed that the end times were real and might be sooner rather than later. Charles I had married a Catholic, and the Church of England had hardly reformed itself according to the Puritans. England was heading toward a civil war as the crown clamped down on religious dissenters, and God was surely vexed. Indeed, this small emigration of settlers might have represented Earth's last chance of survival. God needed to be convinced that at least one settlement, one church, one remnant of humanity could follow his word and obey without question. Otherwise, God in his righteousness might, and indeed should, destroy not only Massachusetts, but the whole world. The city upon a hill with the eyes of all people on it was not a metaphor, but a living reality. And if it took stamping out dissent, heterodoxy, wrong thinking, then that was a small price to pay given the enormous cost of failure. The founding group of what we call Puritans, they called themselves non-separating Congregationalists, meant to establish a colony and government of only the godly. God, of course, knew who these people were. Indeed, these Puritans were Calvinist in the sense of their belief in predestination. Their salvation or damnation was known to God since the beginning of time, and nothing could change that. There were signs, however, of who these elect might be. It was probable that the pious and generous woman who helped her neighbors, meekly went about her business, attended services, raised her children modestly, and worked hard at the many and hard labors of housewifery, was saved. It was unlikely that the village drunk, sleeping it off Sunday morning in the bushes, was. The key to the franchise for adult male, and to office holding as well, was church membership, because it was here that those already hopefully among the godly could separate the saved from the not saved. The Puritans were Congregationalists, meaning that each congregation was separate and independent. Unlike the Church of England, there was no hierarchy, no bishops, no archbishops. Among those who migrated were a number of ministers. It has been said that as a proportion of the population, early Massachusetts had more college educated than any time since. The congregations called the minister and paid for him. Towns built meeting houses, which were all-purpose, serving as town halls and places of worship. Those hoping for church membership gave public testimony before the existing members of why they thought they might be among the elect. Existing members then voted. This was serious business. Many, among the most pious, were unwilling to claim election, since that might be thought of as second-guessing God. There were other signs as well, over which men and women had little control. In perhaps a misguided belief in genetics, the early Puritans extended the possibility of membership to the children of those already judged the elect. These children, once adult, had the opportunity to present themselves for church membership. But as these children became adults, many found scruples which prevented them from stepping forward. What would then happen to their children, the grandchildren of the founders, who now were not children of church members? Over the years, I've come to believe, and I taught, that Protestantism is inherently subversive. There is no pope to make the final decisions about truth. A priesthood of all believers is a priesthood of none. The Roman Catholic priest called down God in the Mass. He delivered sacraments, which opened the door to salvation. The Protestant minister was a first, if even that, among equals, as many a minister writing in the 18th century lamented. In privileging scripture as the sole source of truth, Protestantism opened a Pandora's box. First, the Bible needed to be in some sort of vernacular. Second, it needed to be accessible. And third, it needed a literate audience. In 1536, William Tyndale was burned at the stake for translating the Bible into English. It had been published a year earlier. The Puritans would have carried the Geneva Bible, published in 1560, but in English. Just for reference, the King James Bible was published in 1611. The Puritans could have taken it, they chose not to. Bibles had already been printed by 1536. Indeed, the Gutenberg Bible in Latin had first come out in the 1450s. The printing revolution was some 80 years old by Tyndale's time. Movable type, the key to mass printing, was its own revolution. Type could, of course, be set for anything. Godly works disagreeing with one another, fictional romances, notices of clandestine meetings, anti-government screeds, pornography. The sky is the limit, we all know that. In Massachusetts, the first press was set up by the widow Glover in 1640, whose printing was the Bay Psalm Book, 5 by 7.5 inches, just shy of 300 pages and words only. A printed, accessible Bible needed readers. Literacy was prized in Massachusetts for both men and women. Each town was ordered to establish a school where all children would be taught at least to read. This, of course, didn't always happen. Reading and writing are separate skills, and the evidence suggests that many children learned to read as young as age 3, as Bible reading was a daily public activity in their homes. Each evening, a portion of the Bible would be read to the gathered household, which included children and servants. When the reader came to the end, he or she would then start again at the beginning. Children were taught to write about age 7. Literacy was only part of the training necessary for a godly society. An informed ministry was as well. The Puritans understood they would need to train a ministry themselves, and they had the educated basis of such education already. In 1636, the Great and General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony founded the college. It was named after the minister John Harvard, who left his library and half of his estate to the new institution. Harvard today is one of the 3 American seminaries which train UU ministers. From the very beginning in Massachusetts, ministers found themselves disagreeing about doctrinal fine points. But how could this be if the object was to perfectly please God and save the world? Well, America is the graveyard of utopian dreams. And in fact, it has been since the very beginning. Even in Massachusetts, some ministers seemed more scrupulous than others. Even among the founders, there was disagreement. Connecticut was founded by ministers who were unhappy with Massachusetts congregation's decision not to separate from the Church of England. For them, Boston was not Puritan enough. They didn't think the Church of England redeemable. Some were forced out. They read their Bibles and decided that the ministers in Massachusetts were in error. Rhode Island began as 2 settlements centered on Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. Roger Williams was a beloved, gentle, and godly soul, much liked by John Winthrop and almost everybody else. But he read his Bible and prayed and arrived at conclusions that could never be accepted by the Bay hierarchy. He was one who believed that greater separation was necessary from the Church of England. He also believed in the separation of church and state for the protection not of the state, as we believe, but for the protection of the church, which should not be involved in these worldly matters. In Massachusetts, the state punished religious crimes such as heresy and blasphemy. Williams disagreed that it was the state's business. He advocated for freedom of conscience, independent of state control or oversight. He doubted that any human could know who were saved and who damned, and eventually decided that the only 2 he could be reasonably sure of were his wife and himself. As a sideline, he had become friendly with and sympathetic to the Native Americans. He accused the colonists of stealing their land and abusing them. In 1636, he was accused of sedition and heresy and banished. John Winthrop helped him escape. John Winthrop really liked him. And he made his way to what would become Rhode Island, which became a haven for the malcontent. The Dutch called it the latrina of New England. Puritans believed that Revelation was sealed. God had said all he had to say in the Bible. And Hutchinson believed God spoke to her directly. And what he told her was which ministers were saved and which were not. He also advised her which laws were godly and which only human and thus not binding. Tried and convicted by a jury chaired by John Winthrop, she was banished in 1638 and moved to be near the Providence settlement founded by Roger Williams. She would later move on to New Amsterdam, where in 1643, she and her family were killed by Native Americans in an Indian war incited by the then Dutch governor. Williams and Hutchinson were banished. Others were not treated so gently. The political and religious ferment that had sired Puritans were also progenitors to other religious movements, including the Religious Society of Friends, or Quakers. Founded by George Fox in the 1650s, they believed in the inner light, God's voice available to all of us in the silence. They were pacifists, believed in conscience, and literally the priesthood of all believers. Clergy were called hireling priests. It wasn't a compliment. Gentle and persistent, they traveled throughout England and arrived in Massachusetts in 1656, where their 2 female missionaries were imprisoned and banished. Not ones to give up, Quakers tried again and again, until the frustrated and angry magistrates, somewhere between 1659 and 1661, hanged 3 men and a woman. They became known as the Boston Martyrs. But by 1660, now 30 years after John Winthrop's speech aboard the Arbella, Massachusetts was a very different place than God's last hope for the world. Between 1630 and 1640, the local economy depended on new emigration as dissenting English Protestants faced more and more hardship. Some 20,000 people left England for New England. These new people needed homes, goods, services, and they paid for them. In fact, they were the economy. In 1640, it all changed. Puritans in England took up arms, and in 1641, the English Civil War, which pitted dissenters against the Church of England and Puritans against the Crown, began. Between 7 and 10% of colonists returned, and maybe 1/3 of the clergy, since it now seemed that the religious fight needed support and that the Church of England might indeed be reclaimed. Each had to decide whether to stay or go. John Winthrop stayed. But the loss of immigrants also meant the loss of revenue and a crisis for the economic health of the colony. They were on their own. Massachusetts had resources. The colony was close to the Newfoundland banks, so rich in cod. The forests were full of large trees. People were skilled as well. There were fishermen and lumbermen, sawmills and coopers. Good harbors meant boat building and boat repair. Boston and Salem had established merchants. Instead of looking inward, Massachusetts Bay looked outward, especially toward the West Indies, where the sugar plantations needed casks, lumber, shipping, and slaves. Increased trade meant increased wealth. Merchants and ship owners chafed under a system of government that depended upon a public profession of faith to participate. In 1647, the law allowed some non-church members to vote locally, and in 1658, any male with certain property qualifications could vote in local elections. This franchise was expanded to provincial elections in 1686. Church rules also loosened as founding members realized that their grandchildren could not be church members as things were. In 1660, the English Civil War ended with the restoration of Charles II. The king was back, but a more liberal, or some thought libertine, king. He was called the Merry Monarch, and he drank, and he fathered illegitimate children, and he loved the theater. He died without legitimate heirs, and the crown moved to his brother, James II. James might have been a secret Catholic, and his second wife, Mary of Modena, was a practicing one. Catholics were too scary, and Parliament moved to make sure that England would never have one as king. The Glorious Revolution of 1689 sent James into exile and brought his daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange to the throne. More important to our story is that England passed the 1689 Act of Toleration, which enshrined the right of all Protestants to practice their religion in England and the colonies. Along with this act was a reform of colonial governments, especially aimed at freewheeling Massachusetts, whose ships and merchants had been invading the navigation acts. So to pull together the various pieces, America was always religiously pluralistic. John Winthrop's city upon a hill was not only to be a light unto the nations, but a demonstration to God that humankind should be spared. This in turn required severe discipline and adherence to sets of rules that it turned out were not agreed upon, even in the beginning. Massachusetts effluvia settled itself mainly in Rhode Island, where Baptists and other Protestants, Quakers, and even Jews found some measure of religious freedom. Pure churches turned out to be an impossible standard, as pious believers like Anne Hutchinson challenged who was pure or not, and who decided who was pure and who was not. Religious pluralism could only flourish where there was so much land and no centralized religious authority. Congregationalism begets congregations. Go down any South Carolina road and count the different Baptist churches. Religion and politics are tied at the hip. From the beginning, Massachusetts Bay Colony tied religious membership and qualifications to political participation. They did not believe in the separation of church and state and exiled Roger Williams for questioning that tie. Other colonies offer more blatant examples. In Maryland, founded as a Catholic haven, Protestants played on anti-Catholic sentiment in England to overturn the government of the Catholic Calverts and prevent Catholics from holding office. On the eve of the Revolution, The Catholic Charles Carroll of Carrollton, arguably the wealthiest man in colonial America, could not hold office or vote in Maryland. He was the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence. William Smith, one of New York colony's most lucid and best orators, gave a heart-wrenching speech in the Assembly in 1737 describing the agonies of Christ on the cross as he advocated taking the franchise away from the city's very few adult male Jews. They would have supported the other faction. Finally, John Winthrop's whole life was undoubtedly lived out of conviction. Those who banished Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams and hanged 4 pesky Quakers did so out of conscience. And yet much good comes out of conscience as well. We act well towards one another, and we respect one another, and we act against those doing harm because some inner voice tells us what is right and what is wrong. Without conscience, there can be no collective action for the common good. We are heirs to all of this, both as UUs and modern Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Closing words?
Okay. Our closing words are